More than 10 years ago, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that would fundamentally change the Voting Rights Act. In Shelby County versus Holder, the High Court ruled Section 5 of the landmark legislation was unconstitutional. That portion of the law focused on requiring states with a history of racial discrimination in voting practices to submit any proposed changes to the federal government for approval. In the ruling, Chief Justice John Roberts argued the protections were no longer necessary in modern-day America. Well, today, we're seeing the effect of that decision in real time. A study released earlier this year shows the gap in turnout rates between white and non-white voters has grown almost twice as quickly in areas that Section 5 covered compared to other parts of the country. Joining us now, former editor-in-chief of Salon, David Daley. His new book, out now, is entitled Anti-Democratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections.
And David, thank you so much for being here. I think of that ruling also, Chief Justice Roberts said that if the United States Congress wanted to make any adjustments, any corrections, add anything, then obviously they could do that. That at this point, the court was passing it to Congress. Well, we've seen Republicans over the past 2-3 years especially block the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and block other voting rights acts that would actually remedy the disparity here, right?
I think that's exactly right. And what is so interesting about the Chief Justice's decision in the Shelby County case is that he passes it back to Congress, but Congress just 7 years earlier had, in a 390-33 vote in the U.S. House, controlled by Republicans at the time, and a 98-0 vote in the U.S. Senate, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, signed by President George W. Bush, off of a 16,000-page congressional record, 21 hearings that detailed in great specificity the continued need for preclearance, not in 1955, not in 1965, but in towns and cities and localities across the South where elections were being canceled when it looked as if black candidates might go ahead and win them. And instead, the Chief Justice effectively, he said he would be an umpire who called balls and strikes, right? Well, in this case, he tossed out the rule book. He ignored everything that Congress had done just 7 years earlier and effectively went on vibes and made up his own standard. He claimed that there was equal sovereignty among states, and this was simply just a made-up statute that Roberts fashions by taking a different decision by the court, editing out the part he doesn't like and making it say the opposite. He would have gotten an F on a high school term paper for the work he did, and instead the consequences were effectively gutting the most effective piece of civil rights legislation this country's ever seen.
So one of the interesting things about this book, David, is that you tell the story of how he arrived at this particular act that you just described. I mean, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. 15 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected. And then you have that extraordinary debate around its reauthorization in 81, 82. And in some ways, Reagan says, I'll sign it, but we got to get rid of this Section 5 or something like that, right? Tell the story about a young John Roberts in this moment in the Reagan administration, and this long story about how we arrived at the Shelby decision and how we've arrived at this moment in our country's history around voting.
You're exactly right. It has been a very patient, long game that John Roberts has played, but this has been his life's work. John Roberts arrives in the Reagan DOJ, 1981, 1982, fresh off of a clerkship at the U.S. Supreme Court with William Rehnquist, who, of course, has his own history with personally suppressing votes in Arizona back in his youth. And John Roberts is thrust immediately into this debate over the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1982. And there is a case out of Alabama called Mobile v. Bolden, a very important case that a lot of people don't think about. But the Supreme Court in 1980, in many ways, had begun chipping away at the Voting Rights Act and the power of the Reconstruction Amendments. And Democrats and Republicans in Congress working together were trying to fix that in the 1982 reauthorization. Their opponent was 26, 27-year-old John Roberts, who from his desk at the Department of Justice is basically guiding the entire Republican strategy inside DOJ to try and prevent that Supreme Court case from 1980 from effectively being reversed in the 1982 reauthorization. There are memos and draft emails and the talking points and the op-eds that he's written. Roberts is running this behind the scenes. They don't win in this case, right? The Voting Rights Act is reauthorized, and yet the lesson of this is that if Republicans and conservatives within the conservative legal movement want to change the Voting Rights Act, they're not going to be able to do so through the political process. The way to do this is not by winning 218 votes in the House or 51 in the Senate. It is to capture 5 votes on the U.S. Supreme Court, and they go about making that happen.
So, David, given their dedication to disruption, quite successful, and the remnants of the old Republican Party and the existence of today's Supreme Court, do we have a lot to fear this coming fall if Trump loses and takes everything to court again?
I think we do. And I think there's a lot here that is really worrisome. What keeps me up at night would be the idea of a repeat of Bush versus Gore from 2000, in which 1 or 2 states are super duper close, in which there is some sort of certification chicanery, in which there is ongoing litigation during that 6-week period in between Election Day and when the Electoral College meets. I mean, listen, on Election Day, about 180 million of us are going to vote. If this winds up before the U.S. Supreme Court, which all you have to do is look at the 75 cases that the RNC is involved in right now in about 24 different states. They are very patiently laying the groundwork for that 6-week period. It's not going to be 180 million of us deciding who the next president is. It's going to be the 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court, 6 of them effectively picked by Leonard Leo, vetted by the Federalist Society, 3 of them who worked on the Bush versus Gore case back in 2000 in John Roberts and Justice Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh. So there's a lot to work about here. Bush versus Gore was effectively proof of concept for the Republican strategy to capture America through the judiciary. And Chief Justice Roberts, in many ways, has been the most effective Republican politician of his generation.
Oof.
Wow.
You know, there was a striking scene during Madeleine Albright's funeral. And it was a shot, I believe, of the first row, and you had Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama there. And we sat there and looked at the picture. You said, you know, right there, you've had the people who got the most votes in every election since 1992, other than 2004. And John Kerry was actually 2004. But the Supreme Court is dominated by people who have been appointed by presidents who, again, got into the White House after losing the popular vote. I understand our system, I understand what we have, but again, you would think that a court selected the way this one has been selected, also after Merrick Garland wasn't even given a hearing, and then the rules that they passed made up for him, they took away for Amy Coney Barrett. This would not be the sort of court. This is not conservative with a small c. This sort of court that would so freely overturn voting rights rules and so freely overturn a woman's right to choose a 50-year right.
Unbelievable.
That 70% of Americans didn't want overturned.
And why the book is so relevant. The new book is entitled Anti-Democratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American elections. Author David Daley, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning